Have you ever wondered what it would be like to know everything about the people who control your life? To stand in the shadows of power, invisible, while the most dangerous secrets of a nation pass through your ears like water through a sieve? Tonight, I want to tell you about a man whose name was systematically erased from every official document, every registry, every archive in Portugal. And yet, somehow, fragments of his existence survived. Because the truth has a way of surviving even when powerful men try to bury it. This is not a story about violence. This is not a story about fire and blood. This is something far more terrifying to those who held power in 18th century Lisbon. This is a story about a man who learned to become invisible, who absorbed the darkest secrets of the Portuguese Empire, and who watched, patiently, silently, as every single one of his masters fell into ruin while he remained standing. If stories like this move something inside you, if you believe that history has been deliberately incomplete, hit that subscribe button because I bring you these buried truths every week. And what I'm about to reveal tonight will change everything you thought you knew about survival, resistance, and the power of silence. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation will leave you speechless. The house still stands on Rua do Alecrim, though no one living today remembers what happened within those walls during the winter of 1784. The plaster has yellowed, the wooden shutters hang crooked from rusted hinges, and if you press your ear against the ancient door, really press it holding your breath, some say you can still hear the echo of whispered conversations that changed the course of Portuguese history. But that might just be superstition. What is not superstition is the document discovered in the Arquivo Nacional da Torre do Tombo, buried beneath centuries of bureaucratic correspondence. A single page, water-stained and partially illegible, that references a man known only as the shadow who speaks to no one but hears all. That man was Sebastião. And his story begins not in Lisbon, but 3,000 miles away, in the suffocating heat of the African coast. The slave ship Esperança Divina departed from the port of Luanda in March of 1761, carrying 472 human beings in its hold. Sebastião was 17 years old. He had been captured during a raid on his village in the Kingdom of Congo, where his father served as a minor diplomat in the court of the Manicongo. This detail matters. This detail matters more than anything else in this story, because Sebastião was not an ordinary captive. He had been raised in the complex world of African court politics, where a misplaced word could mean death, and a carefully chosen phrase could save a kingdom. He had learned to read the invisible currents of power that flow beneath the surface of every conversation. He had learned to listen, and listening, he would discover, was the most dangerous weapon a slave could possess. The crossing took 47 days. 118 souls perished in the darkness below deck, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony, without prayer, without anyone recording their names. Sebastião survived by making himself useful to the ship's doctor, a half-drunk Galician named Esteban who needed someone to hold the dying while he pretended to heal them. During those 47 days, Sebastião learned his first Portuguese words. He learned them not from lessons, but from listening. He learned the words for water, bread, mercy, death. He learned the cadence of command, the tone of contempt, the subtle differences between an order that would be enforced and one that was merely theatrical. By the time the Esperança Divina reached the Brazilian coast, Sebastião could understand almost everything his captors said. They never suspected. They looked at him and saw only what they expected to see. A body, a commodity, a thing without interiority. This was their first mistake. It would not be their last. The plantation in Bahia lasted 3 years. Sebastião worked the sugar fields until his hands were permanently scarred from the cane, until his back carried the map of the overseer's whip, until his feet knew every stone and root of that cursed land. But the overseer noticed something unusual. The African boy seemed to anticipate problems before they occurred. He appeared at the right place at the right time with an almost supernatural consistency. When a barrel was about to fall, Sebastião was there to catch it. When a fire threatened the drying shed, Sebastião raised the alarm before anyone else smelled smoke. When the overseer mentioned this to the plantation owner, Dom Henrique de Araújo Carvalho, the old man requested to see this unusual slave for himself. What happened in that meeting changed the trajectory of Sebastião's life forever. Dom Henrique was not merely a plantation owner. He was a man with connections to the Portuguese court, a man who had served as a minor diplomat in Madrid before retiring to Brazil to oversee his family's colonial holdings. He had negotiated treaties, managed informants, and survived 3 assassination attempts during his years of service. He recognized something in Sebastião's eyes that most men missed entirely. He recognized intelligence. Not the crude cunning that any desperate creature might develop, but something deeper, the cold, patient intelligence of a survivor, the same quality Dom Henrique had seen in the most dangerous diplomats of European courts. And intelligence, in the colonial economy, could be useful. Very useful indeed. Within 6 months, Sebastião had been transferred from the fields to the house. His new duties were light: maintain Dom Henrique's study, organize his correspondence, ensure that his clothes were always prepared, that his meals arrived at the precise temperature he preferred. But these simple tasks required something that fieldwork did not: proximity. Sebastião now spent hours each day in Dom Henrique's presence, listening to him dictate letters, observing him receive visitors, watching the subtle dance of power that took place in drawing rooms and dining halls. Within a year, he had become Dom Henrique's personal servant, the one trusted with the master's most intimate routines. And within 2 years, when Dom Henrique was recalled to Lisbon to serve in the ministry of the Marquis of Pombal, Sebastião went with him. He crossed the Atlantic again, but this time not in the darkness of a slavehold. This time, he stood behind his master's chair at the captain's table, pouring wine, clearing plates, and listening, always listening, to conversations about politics, commerce, war, and the fragile architecture of European power. The passengers spoke freely in front of him. They discussed the decline of Spanish influence in South America. They debated the growing tensions with England over colonial trade routes. They speculated about the health of King José I, whose recent illness had thrown the entire court into uncertainty. They spoke as if Sebastião were a piece of furniture, no more capable of understanding or repeating their words than the mahogany table upon which they rested their elbows. And Sebastião let them believe this. He perfected the art of the empty gaze, the slack posture, the face that revealed nothing and absorbed everything. By the time the ship reached Lisbon harbor, Sebastião knew more about Portuguese state affairs than many minor nobles ever would. Lisbon in 1766 was a city being rebuilt from catastrophe. 11 years earlier, on the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, the ground had begun to shake. The earthquake lasted between 3 and 6 minutes, but those minutes were enough to reduce the capital of the Portuguese Empire to rubble. Churches collapsed onto congregations gathered for Mass. The royal palace crumbled. Fires broke out across the city, fed by the thousands of candles that had been lit for the holy day. And then came the tsunami, a wall of water that surged up the Tagus River and drowned those who had fled to the waterfront seeking open ground. When the destruction finally ceased, between 30,000 and 60,000 people lay dead beneath the ruins of what had been one of Europe's wealthiest cities. The Marquis of Pombal had seized the moment to remake both the city and the state according to Enlightenment principles. While others wept and prayed, Pombal organized. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he famously commanded, and then set about the systematic reconstruction of Portuguese society itself. He expelled the Jesuits, whom he blamed for the country's backwardness. He reformed the tax system, stripped the nobility of many traditional privileges, and concentrated power in the hands of a bureaucratic elite that answered to him alone. He rebuilt Lisbon on a grid plan, with wide boulevards and uniform buildings designed to resist future earthquakes. and he filled his ministry with men who shared his vision of a rational, efficient, centralized state. Men like Dom Henrique de Araujo Carvalho. The house on Rua do Alecrim became a nexus of political intrigue. It stood in the Baixa district, the heart of the new Lisbon that had risen from the earthquake's ruins. 3 stories of pale stone, with windows that looked out over the Tagus River, where ships arrived daily from Brazil, India, Africa, and the far reaches of the Portuguese trading empire. Every evening men arrived in closed carriages, their faces obscured by the darkness. They climbed the stairs to Dom Henrique's study, where candles flickered and voices dropped to whispers. Sebastião served them wine. Sebastião emptied their ashtrays. Sebastião stood motionless in the corner of the room, so still that the men sometimes forgot he existed entirely. And while they forgot, they talked. If you want to follow more cases like this one, stories that shake the foundations of what we think we know about history, subscribe to this channel so you never miss an investigation. The first secret Sebastião learned was minor, a trade agreement with England that had been negotiated outside official channels, benefiting certain merchants with connections to the ministry. He filed this information away in his memory and said nothing. The second secret was more significant, a plan to manipulate grain prices in the northern provinces, creating artificial scarcity that would enrich Pombal's allies, while ordinary Portuguese starved. Sebastião absorbed this knowledge and remained silent. The third secret could have toppled the government itself, evidence that the attempted assassination of King José I in 1758 had been orchestrated not by the Távora family, as officially claimed, but by members of Pombal's own inner circle who had then framed their rivals. This is where the story begins to twist in ways that no one, not Dom Henrique, not Pombal, not even Sebastião himself, could have anticipated. The household on Rua do Alecrim was not a simple establishment. Beyond Dom Henrique, there lived his wife Dona Maria Augusta, a woman of 43 years, whose face had settled into a permanent expression of disappointed contempt. There were the 2 sons, Fernando and Augusto, young men in their 20s who spent their father's money with the enthusiasm of heirs who believed the fortune would never end. There was a staff of 11 servants, including a cook from the Minho region, 2 housemaids, a coachman, a gardener, and various others whose duties overlapped in the chaotic manner typical of wealthy Portuguese households. And there were 3 other enslaved persons besides Sebastião. A woman named Josefa, who served as Dona Maria Augusta's personal maid, an older man called Tomás, who maintained the stables, and a boy of perhaps 12 named Bento, whose primary function seemed to be receiving kicks and curses from the young masters whenever they were in foul moods. Sebastião observed everything. He observed how Dom Henrique's hands trembled when he received certain letters, how his face drained of color when particular names were mentioned. He observed how Dona Maria Augusta's eyes followed the younger servants with a hunger that had nothing to do with domestic management. He observed how Fernando and Augusto whispered together in corners, their conversations cutting short whenever their father approached. He observed how the cook secreted away small amounts of food each week, building a hidden reserve that she sold to neighbors at inflated prices. He observed how the coachman visited a certain house in the Alfama district every Thursday night, a house where information flowed as freely as wine. He observed all of this, and he understood that every person in this household was keeping secrets, and that secrets were the true currency of power. The routine established itself with the mechanical precision that Sebastião would later recognize as both his greatest protection and his greatest danger. He woke each day before dawn, descending from the narrow room in the attic where he slept on a straw mattress alongside Tomás and young Bento. He heated water for Dom Henrique's morning ablutions, laid out the master's clothes, prepared his shaving implements. He served breakfast in the small dining room, standing silently by the sideboard while Dom Henrique ate his bread and cheese and read his correspondence. Then came the hours of waiting while Dom Henrique received visitors, waiting while he wrote his endless letters, waiting while he paced his study muttering about political maneuvers that Sebastião understood better than Dom Henrique realized. The trick was never to seem too capable. This was the lesson Sebastião had learned in those first years in Bahia, watching other slaves who had revealed too much intelligence and suffered for it. The master who discovers that his property can think begins to fear that property. And fear, in a master, leads inevitably to cruelty. So Sebastião calibrated his performance with exquisite care. He anticipated Dom Henrique's needs just enough to be valued as a servant, but never so much that he seemed uncanny. He allowed small mistakes, minor fumbles, moments of apparent confusion that reinforced the master's comfortable belief in his own superiority. He became, in effect, two people. The shuffling, reliable, slightly dim servant that Dom Henrique saw, and the watchful intelligence that recorded everything behind that carefully constructed mask. Leave a comment below. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The year 1770 brought the first crack in the edifice of Pombal's power. King José I suffered another episode of his mysterious illness, leaving him bedridden for 3 months. During this period, Queen Mariana Vitoria and the heir apparent, Prince José, began to assert themselves in ways that made Pombal deeply uncomfortable. Whispers circulated through Lisbon's salons. The Marquis had made too many enemies, the nobility would have their revenge, the Jesuits would return, everything Pombal had built would be swept away the moment the old king died. Sebastião heard these whispers because Dom Henrique heard them, and Dom Henrique heard everything. The master had become increasingly anxious during this period, his hands trembling more violently, his sleep disturbed by nightmares from which he woke gasping and calling out names that Sebastião recognized from the secret conversations in the study. Names of men who had been executed after the 1758 assassination attempt. Names of families who had been imprisoned, tortured, stripped of their titles and properties. Names that, if connected to Dom Henrique's current position, would reveal the full extent of his complicity in what had been, essentially, a judicial murder conducted to eliminate Pombal's political rivals. The fear in that house became something you could almost smell. It accumulated in corners like dust, thickened the air of Dom Henrique's study, hung over the dinner table like smoke from an invisible fire. And Sebastião watched. He watched the late-night meetings become more frequent, more secretive. He watched the documents that Dom Henrique burned in his fireplace, papers that contained words Sebastião could not read but whose destruction he understood perfectly. He watched the new locks installed on the study door, the new hiding places constructed behind wooden panels, the preparations being made for some future catastrophe that Dom Henrique could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. In 1771, Sebastião received an unexpected gift: literacy. It came not through formal instruction but through the carelessness of Augusto, Dom Henrique's younger son, who had taken to using Sebastião as a kind of living writing desk. Augusto would compose his letters while lying on a divan, dictating to the empty air, while Sebastião sat nearby holding the inkwell, the pens, the paper. One day, in a fit of laziness that bordered on the theatrical, Augusto commanded Sebastião to write a letter himself. Just a simple note to a creditor, nothing important. Surely even a slave could manage that. Sebastião pretended ignorance. He held the pen incorrectly. He made the letters malformed and childish. Augusto laughed, snatched the pen away, and wrote the letter himself. But the seed had been planted. Over the following months, Augusto occasionally repeated this game, amused by the spectacle of his family's slaves struggling with letters like a child. And each time, Sebastião improved just slightly, just enough to suggest natural progress, never enough to suggest true capability. Within a year, he could read Portuguese fluently. Within 2 years, he had taught himself Spanish and French from the books in Dom Henrique's library, volumes that he examined during the late hours when the household slept. He never read when anyone could observe him. He never left any trace of his nocturnal studies. But now, when documents passed through his hands, when letters arrived or were sent, when contracts and conspiracies were committed to paper. Sebastião could understand not just the spoken words, but the written ones as well. The written record revealed depths of corruption that even Sebastião's sharp ears had not fully grasped. Dom Henrique had been involved in the slave trade for decades, not merely as a plantation owner, but as an investor in the ships themselves. He had financed voyages that transported tens of thousands of human beings from Africa to Brazil, taking his percentage of each sale, each body that survived the crossing. The ledgers were meticulous, recording deaths at sea as losses calculated against projected revenues, treating human beings as cargo no different from sugar or tobacco. Sebastião found his own name in one of these ledgers. Male, approximately 17 years, good health, purchased Luanda March 1761, sold Bahia May 1761, profit 23 mil reis. 23,000 reis. That was the price at which his life had been valued. That was the sum total of his worth in the eyes of the men who had stolen him from his home, killed his family, and transported him across the ocean in chains. He did not react to this discovery. He did not rage, did not weep, did not allow any external sign of the cold fire that had been burning in his chest since the day of his capture. He simply filed the information away with all the other information, adding it to the vast archive of secrets that he carried in his memory. Because information, he had learned, was power, and power, accumulated slowly and carefully, could become a weapon more devastating than any blade. The death of King José I on February 24, 1777, changed everything. His daughter Maria I ascended to the throne, and within weeks, the carefully constructed world of Pombaline, Portugal began to collapse. The new queen despised the Marquis of Pombal with an intensity that bordered on the pathological. Her first act was to exile him from Lisbon. Her second was to release the political prisoners who had languished in dungeons since the purges of 1758. Her third was to begin an investigation into the crimes committed under Pombal's rule. Crimes in which Dom Henrique de Araújo Carvalho had been deeply complicit. The house on Rua do Alecrim became a fortress under siege. Dom Henrique barricaded himself in his study, burning documents day and night, the smoke rising from his chimney so constantly that neighbors began to complain. Visitors who had once arrived in elegant carriages now came on foot in disguise, entering through the servants' entrance at the rear of the house. The conversations Sebastião overheard were no longer about political maneuvers and commercial opportunities. They were about survival, escape, the possibility of fleeing to Brazil before the Queen's investigators could gather enough evidence to bring charges. But Dom Henrique was too slow. On the morning of March 15, 1778, a carriage bearing the royal seal arrived at the house. 4 men in the uniform of the Royal Guard entered without knocking, and presented Dom Henrique with a summons to appear before the Tribunal of Inconfidencia. The charges were vague, crimes against the crown and the Portuguese people, but everyone in that household understood what they meant. Dom Henrique, dressed in his finest clothes, kissed his wife and sons goodbye, and departed in the royal carriage. He would never return. What followed was a masterpiece of legal persecution. The tribunal convened in secret, heard testimony from witnesses whose identities were never revealed, and pronounced judgment without allowing Dom Henrique to confront his accusers or present evidence in his own defense. He was found guilty of complicity in the false accusations that had led to the execution of the Duke of Aveiro and the imprisonment of the Tavera family. His property was forfeit to the crown. His titles were revoked. He himself was sentenced to life imprisonment in the fortress of São Julião da Barra, a cold stone edifice at the mouth of the Tagus where prisoners were known to disappear without trace. Dona Maria Augusta received the news with a shriek that echoed through every room of the house on Rua do Alecrim. She collapsed onto her bed and remained there for 3 days, attended by Josefa, receiving no visitors, eating nothing, speaking to no one. Fernando and Augusto retreated to their respective chambers and emerged only to conduct frantic negotiations with lawyers, creditors, and anyone else who might help them salvage something from the wreckage of their father's disgrace. The servants whispered among themselves, already calculating which of them would be sold first and to whom. Sebastião observed all of this with the patient attention he had cultivated over 17 years of enslavement. He noted which documents had survived Dom Henrique's frenzied burning, which hiding places had been forgotten in the panic of arrest, which secrets remained buried in the walls of that house. He noted, too, the shifting dynamics of power among the remaining family members. How Dona Maria Augusta's despair was beginning to curdle into rage. How Fernando's desperate scheming was creating new enemies. How Augusto's creditors were closing in with demands that could no longer be deferred. The household was sold in August of 1778. The creditors descended like carrion birds, stripping away furniture, paintings, silver, books, everything of value, including the 4 enslaved human beings who had served the family. Josefa was purchased by a convent. Tomas was bought by a merchant who needed workers for his warehouse. Young Bento was sold to a plantation owner who was returning to Brazil. And Sebastião was acquired by a man whose name would become, in the years that followed, synonymous with the worst excesses of the old regime. Dom Luís de Mendonça Furtado, the Viscount of Barbacena. The Viscount was 63 years old when he purchased Sebastião, a man whose face bore the evidence of a lifetime of cruelty. Not cruelty received, but cruelty inflicted. His eyes were small and calculating beneath heavy brows. His mouth seemed permanently fixed in an expression of contemptuous amusement. His hands, despite his age, remained strong and capable of violence. He had served Pombal faithfully for decades, overseeing the interrogation of political prisoners, the extraction of confessions, the administration of tortures that were technically illegal, but practically essential to the maintenance of state power. When the Queen's investigators came for him, he had escaped prosecution only through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and the strategic elimination of witnesses. He was, in short, one of the most dangerous men in Portugal, and Sebastião was now his property. The Viscount's household was located in the Alfama district, in an ancient palace that had survived the earthquake of 1755. The building itself seemed to embody the darkness of its owner. Narrow corridors, low ceilings, windows that admitted little light, rooms that smelled of damp stone, and something else, something organic and unpleasant, that Sebastião eventually identified as fear. The Viscount kept 7 enslaved servants, all African, all trained to absolute obedience through methods that Sebastião would come to know intimately. The first beating came on his 3rd day in the household, for an infraction so minor that Sebastião could not even identify what rule he had violated. The Viscount administered the punishment himself, using a wooden cane that he kept beside his chair for this purpose, delivering 15 strokes to Sebastião's back while explaining, in a conversational tone, that this was simply a reminder of the proper order of things. "Pain is the only language your kind truly understands," the Viscount said as Sebastião lay bleeding on the floor. "Remember this conversation, and we will not need to repeat it." But the Viscount's cruelty was not merely physical. He was a man who took pleasure in psychological torment, in the slow destruction of his victim's sense of self. He would praise Sebastião's intelligence in front of guests, describing him as almost human in his capabilities, then privately humiliate him for the same qualities. He would assign tasks that were impossible to complete, then punish the inevitable failure. He would encourage small hopes, the suggestion of eventual manumission, the possibility of being taught to read, the promise of lighter duties, then crush those hopes with deliberate cruelty. He was, Sebastião came to understand, a man who had spent so many years tormenting political prisoners that he could no longer experience pleasure in any other way. What the Viscount did not understand, what he could not possibly have understood, was that Sebastião had been trained in a harder school than any Portuguese dungeon. He had survived the Middle Passage. He had survived the sugar fields of Bahia. He had spent 17 years perfecting the art of invisible resistance, of survival through self-negation, of maintaining an inner fortress that no external force could breach. The Viscount's torments were terrible, yes, but they were not the worst things Sebastião had endured, and they could not touch the core of what he had become. Moreover, the Viscount talked. He talked constantly, compulsively, the way that men who have committed great crimes often talk, as if by narrating their actions, they could somehow justify them, somehow escape the weight of their own guilt. He talked to Sebastião, while the slave dressed him in the morning, while he served meals, while he attended to the countless small duties that proximity to power required. He talked about the interrogations he had conducted, the confessions he had extracted, the prisoners who had broken under his methods. He talked about Pombal's inner circle, about the conspiracies that had shaped Portuguese politics for 30 years, about secrets that could still destroy powerful men. And Sebastião listened. He listened and remembered, adding each new piece of information to the vast mosaic he had been assembling since his first days in Dom Henrique's household. He now knew things that no enslaved person should ever have learned. He knew about the falsified evidence in the Tavera trial. He knew about the embezzlement schemes that had enriched Pombal's allies. He knew about the assassinations that had been disguised as natural deaths, the bribes that had purchased judicial verdicts, the secret agreements between the Portuguese crown and foreign powers. He knew, in short, the truth about how power operated in 18th century Portugal. And he was beginning to understand how that knowledge might be used. The year 1782 brought an epidemic of yellow fever to Lisbon. The disease swept through the city's poorer neighborhoods with devastating speed, killing thousands in the space of a few weeks. The Viscount of Barbacena, terrified of contagion, retreated to his country estate near Sintra, taking only essential servants, including Sebastião. The removal from Lisbon had an unexpected consequence: isolation from the political intrigues that had occupied the Viscount's attention for decades. With no visitors to intimidate, no enemies to plot against, no victims to torment, the other servants having been left behind in the city, the old man became increasingly melancholy, increasingly prone to nostalgic reminiscence about the glory days of Pombal's reign. It was during this period that the Viscount made his fatal error. One evening, deep in his cups, he began to speak about a document, a letter he called it, written in Pombal's own hand, that detailed the conspiracy behind the Tavora affair. This letter, if it still existed, would prove conclusively that the 1758 assassination attempt had been orchestrated by Pombal himself, as a pretext for eliminating his rivals. The Viscount had been tasked with destroying this letter after the executions were carried out. But he had not destroyed it. He had kept it, hidden away, as insurance against the day when Pombal might decide that the Viscount himself knew too much. "That letter is my protection," the Viscount slurred, his words heavy with wine and the weight of decades of secrets. "As long as I have it, no one can touch me. Not the Queen, not the tribunal, not anyone. They know that if they come for me, that letter goes straight to the English ambassador, and then the whole rotten edifice comes crashing down." Sebastião said nothing. He poured more wine into the Viscount's glass and waited for the old man to continue. But the Viscount had fallen into brooding silence, staring into the fire with eyes that seemed to see things invisible to anyone else in the room. He did not mention the letter again that evening. But Sebastião had heard enough. He knew now that a document existed that could reshape the political landscape of Portugal. And he knew that this document was somewhere in the Viscount's possession. The search took nearly a year. Sebastião could not afford to raise suspicion by appearing too curious about the Viscount's papers, so he proceeded with agonizing caution, examining the household secrets one small piece at a time. He learned the location of every hiding place in the Alfama Palace, every loose stone and hollow panel that the Viscount used to conceal valuables. He memorized the patterns of household activity, the moments when various rooms were empty, the rhythms of surveillance that governed servant life. And gradually, piece by piece, he assembled a map of possibilities, places where a document of such importance might be hidden. He found it in October of 1783, concealed in a compartment behind a false brick in the Viscount's bedchamber. The letter was exactly as the old man had described. A single page, written in a hand that Sebastião did not recognize, but that bore the distinctive seal of the Marquis of Pombal. The contents were devastating. In clear, unambiguous language, Pombal outlined the plan to fabricate evidence of an assassination conspiracy, to implicate the Tavera and Aveiro families, and to use their executions as a warning to any other nobles who might oppose his reforms. The letter named names, specified dates, detailed the roles that various collaborators would play in the deception. It was, in short, a confession of judicial murder, written by the murderer himself. Sebastião memorized the letter's contents word for word, then returned it to its hiding place. He did not take the document, not yet. The time was not right. But he now possessed knowledge that could bring down some of the most powerful remaining figures of the Pombaline regime, knowledge that could reshape his own fate in ways that he was only beginning to imagine. The Viscount of Barbacena died on January 17, 1784, not from yellow fever but from an apoplectic fit that struck him while he was supervising the beating of a household servant. One moment he was standing, cane raised, his face flushed with the familiar excitement of cruelty. The next moment he was on the floor, his body convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head, strange sounds emerging from his throat. The servants watched in silence as their tormentor expired on the cold stone floor of his own palace. No one moved to help him. No one called for a physician. They simply waited until the convulsions ceased, until the body lay still, until they were certain that the Viscount of Barbacena would never rise to hurt them again. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth." The Viscount's death created a brief window of chaos during which Sebastião was able to retrieve the Pombal letter from its hiding place. The household was in disarray, the heirs arguing over the distribution of property, the servants uncertain of their own fates. In this confusion, no one noticed that a single piece of paper had disappeared from a secret compartment that no one except the Viscount had known existed. Sebastião concealed the letter in the lining of his coat and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was both predictable and fortunate. The Viscount, having never married and having outlived his siblings, left no direct heir. His estate, including his enslaved servants, passed to a distant cousin named Dom Pedro de Mendonça Furtado, a young man of 28 who lived in Coimbra and had no interest whatsoever in maintaining a household in Lisbon. Within 3 months of the Viscount's death, Dom Pedro had sold the Alfama Palace and disposed of all the servants. Sebastião was purchased by a lawyer named Antonio José da Silva Meneses, a man of progressive views who believed that slavery was a moral abomination, but who nonetheless owned 3 enslaved persons because, as he explained to visitors, one cannot simply abandon the economic realities of our society overnight. Silva Meneses was, in his way, as dangerous a master as the Viscount had been, not because of cruelty, but because of his tendency to treat Sebastião as a kind of intellectual curiosity. He had discovered, within weeks of the purchase, that his new servant could read, write, and speak multiple languages. Rather than punishing these abilities, Silva Meneses celebrated them, showing Sebastião off to his friends as proof that Africans were capable of civilization when properly educated. He allowed Sebastião access to his library, engaged him in philosophical discussions, and even, on one memorable occasion, asked his opinion on a legal brief concerning property rights. This liberality created opportunities that Sebastião exploited with careful precision. He was now able to read newspapers, to follow political developments, to understand the currents of thought that were reshaping Portuguese society in the wake of Pombal's fall. He learned about the Enlightenment philosophers whose ideas had inspired the reforms of the previous decades, and whose ideas were now being used to argue against the very institution that kept him in bondage. He learned about the French Revolution, which had erupted in 1789 and was sending shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. He learned about the growing movement to abolish the slave trade, led by English evangelicals whose moral arguments were beginning to influence policy in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. He also learned that several of the men implicated in the Pombal letter were still alive and still powerful. Most significantly, he learned that one of these men, a former judge named Francisco Xavier de Oliveira, who had helped fabricate the evidence against the Tavera family, had recently been appointed to the Royal Council of Justice, the highest judicial body in Portugal. This appointment had caused outrage among those who remembered the old crimes, but Oliveira had powerful protectors, and the scandal had eventually subsided. He remained in his position, dispensing justice to others while his own crimes went unpunished. Until now. Sebastião did not act impulsively. He had learned, over 23 years of enslavement, that impulsive action was the enemy of effective resistance. He waited until the moment was precisely right, until all the pieces of his plan had fallen into place, until the risk of failure had been reduced to an acceptable minimum. The moment came in September of 1784, when Silva Menezes was away in Porto on legal business, and Sebastião was left in charge of the household with minimal supervision. He wrote 3 letters that night, working by candlelight in the small room where Silva Menezes kept his legal papers. The first letter was addressed to the British ambassador in Lisbon, with a copy of the Pombal document enclosed. The letter explained, in formal diplomatic language, that certain parties in England had expressed interest in evidence of Portuguese judicial corruption, and that this document might be of value to them. The second letter was addressed to the editor of the Gazeta de Lisboa, offering exclusive information about crimes committed during the Pombaline era. The third letter was addressed to Francisco Xavier de Oliveira himself, informing him that evidence of his complicity in judicial murder was about to become public, unless certain conditions were met. The conditions were simple. Sebastião demanded his freedom, documented and legally registered. He demanded safe passage to England, where he intended to live as a free man, and he demanded a sum of money sufficient to establish himself in his new country. In exchange, he would ensure that the original Pombal letter was destroyed and that no further copies would be released. It was blackmail, pure and simple. It was also, Sebastião reasoned, justice, the only form of justice available to a man in his position. He had been stolen from his home, transported in chains, worked nearly to death, beaten, humiliated, and treated as property for 23 years. He had watched his masters commit crimes that would have sent ordinary men to the gallows. He had been forced to serve the very men who had built their fortunes on the suffering of people like him. And now, finally, he had the power to extract some small measure of compensation for all that he had endured. The letters were dispatched through channels that Sebastião had carefully cultivated during his years in various households. A network of servants, freedmen, and sympathetic Portuguese who were willing to carry messages for a price. He knew that the recipients would receive them within days. He knew that the information they contained would cause panic among those who had believed their secrets safely buried. And he knew that his own life was now in immediate danger. What happened next unfolded with a speed that surprised even Sebastião. Within a week of the letter's dispatch, Francisco Xavier de Oliveira was dead, officially from a sudden illness, though rumors immediately began to circulate about the true cause. 2 other men named in the Pombal letter fled Lisbon for Spain, abandoning their positions and their property in their haste to escape. The British ambassador dispatched an urgent communication to London, the contents of which were never made public, but which reportedly caused considerable excitement in certain government offices. And Sebastião received a visitor, a young lawyer named João Baptista da Silva, who arrived at Silva Menezes' house bearing documents of manumission signed by 3 different parties, a letter of credit drawn on a London banking house, and passage on a ship departing for Portsmouth within the fortnight. "You are either the most brilliant man I have ever encountered," João Baptista said, regarding Sebastião with an expression that mixed admiration with something like fear, "or you are the most dangerous. Perhaps both." Sebastião accepted the documents without emotion. He had learned long ago that visible emotion was a luxury that enslaved people could not afford. But inside, in the fortress of his inner self that no master had ever breached, he permitted himself a moment of profound satisfaction. He had survived. He had outlasted his tormentors. And he had won his freedom not through violence, not through rebellion, but through the careful accumulation and strategic deployment of information. He had beaten them at their own game. The ship Maria Amalia departed Lisbon harbor on October 3, 1784, carrying cargo bound for English ports. Among its passengers was a free man of approximately 40 years, traveling under the name Sebastian Freeman, a name he had chosen himself, the first name he had ever chosen in his life. He stood on the deck as the ship passed the fortress of São Julião da Barra, where Dom Henrique de Araújo Carvalho had died in captivity 3 years earlier. He watched as Lisbon's distinctive skyline receded into the morning mist, as the Tagus River widened into the Atlantic, as the coast of Portugal gradually disappeared below the horizon. He carried almost nothing with him, a small trunk containing a few changes of clothes, the documents proving his freedom, the letter of credit that would allow him to establish himself in England, and a leather-bound notebook filled with his small, precise handwriting in which he had recorded everything he had learned during his 23 years of enslavement, every secret, every crime, every revelation that had passed through his ears during those decades of invisible servitude. The notebook would eventually make its way to the archives of a London abolitionist society, where it would be read with astonishment by men who had never imagined that an enslaved servant could possess such detailed knowledge of Portuguese state affairs. Its contents would contribute to the growing body of evidence against the slave trade, providing first-hand testimony of the corruption and cruelty that undergirded the entire system. And its author would be celebrated briefly, in certain progressive circles as a symbol of African intelligence and dignity, before being largely forgotten by history, as so many freed slaves were forgotten, his story submerged beneath the vast tide of human suffering that the Atlantic slave trade represented. But Sebastião Freeman did not care about fame or historical recognition. He had never sought to be a symbol. He had simply sought to survive, and then to escape, and finally to live whatever years remained to him as a free man. He achieved all three of these goals. According to the fragmentary records that survive, he settled in Bristol, where he worked as a translator and clerk for a shipping company. He married a free black woman named Mary, a former servant from Jamaica. He had 3 children, all of whom were born free under English law. And he lived until 1814, dying at the approximate age of 70. A remarkable longevity for any man of his era, and an almost miraculous one for someone who had endured what he had endured. The house on Rua do Alecrim still stands, as I mentioned at the beginning of this story. If you ever visit Lisbon, you can walk past it, though there is no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate the extraordinary events that took place within its walls 2.5 centuries ago. The Viscount of Barbacina's palace in the Alfama district was demolished in the 19th century, replaced by ordinary apartment buildings. The archives of the Torre do Tombo contain fragments, letters, receipts, legal documents that hint at Sebastião's existence without ever telling his full story. And the Pombal letter itself has never been found, though historians continue to debate whether it ever existed at all. Some say it was destroyed, as Sebastião promised it would be. Others say it was preserved somewhere, waiting to be discovered by some future researcher who will finally confirm the full truth about the Tavora affair. And a few say that Sebastião kept a copy for himself, hidden among his papers, a final insurance policy against a world that he had learned never to trust entirely. We may never know the truth. What we do know is this: a young man was stolen from his home in Africa, transported across the ocean in chains, and sold into a life of brutal servitude. He spent 23 years as the property of powerful men, watching them commit crimes with impunity, absorbing their secrets, biding his time. And when the moment came, he used what he had learned to win his freedom and begin a new life on his own terms. He did not overthrow the system that had enslaved him. He did not lead a rebellion or become a martyr. He simply survived, outlasted his oppressors, and walked away free. In a world that denied his humanity, that treated him as a commodity, that sought to reduce him to nothing more than a pair of hands and a strong back, Sebastian proved that he was more than what his masters saw. He proved that intelligence, patience, and the strategic use of information could be weapons as powerful as any sword or gun. He proved that even the most absolute systems of oppression contain vulnerabilities that the oppressed can exploit. And he proved that survival itself can be a form of resistance, perhaps the most profound form of all. The next time you walk down a street in an old city, past buildings that have stood for centuries, remember that those walls have witnessed more than we can ever know. Remember that servants and slaves stood in corners of rooms where history was made, listening, watching, remembering. Remember that the powerless have always had their own ways of fighting back, their own strategies for survival, their own quiet victories over those who sought to own them. And remember Sebastian, the shadow who spoke to no one but heard everything, the man who outlived his masters and walked into freedom carrying their secrets with him. Like this video if Sebastian's story touched your heart. Share it so that his memory is never forgotten. And subscribe to this channel if you believe that these hidden truths deserve to be told. Until next time.